Folktales, 6 programmes presented by Tony Arthur. Programme 1, And Thereby Hangs a Tale.
A folk tale is a story that gets passed around from person to person. It can be the sort of story you heard as a kid, like Jack and the Beanstalk, or even that joke someone told you the other day. By the way, have you heard this one about the cow and the turps?
2 old farmers used to meet every Saturday up at the Boar's Head pub. One Saturday, one of them said to the other one, "I say, George, what'd you give your old cow when her was bad?" "Oh," he says, "I gives her a pint of turps." So he said, "Oh, thank you. Well, I met there the following Saturday, and the old boy went up and he said, "I say, George," he said, "what'd you say you give your old cow when her was bad?" "Oh," he says, "I gives her a pint of turps." He said, "Well, that's queer." He said, "I give mine a pint of turps, and she died." He says, "Yeah, so did mine."
That was Nelson Russell. He's a neighbour of mine who's got a fund of amusing stories and anecdotes. Although these yarns, as Nelson calls them, are indeed a form of folk tale, the ones most of us are more familiar with are the fairy stories that we heard as children. Though they don't seem to have many fairies in them, for they're more likely to be about simple, clean-living country folk outwitting wicked stepmothers or supernatural nasties, and eventually marrying into the aristocracy or even royalty. But jokes and fairy tales are just 2 examples of the many types of folk tale. These tales have been passed around the world by word of mouth since the beginning of time. Even in these days of the printed word and mass media, a good tale is still a good tale, and therefore well worth passing on. It gets polished and perfected by generations of storytellers, and points out many aspects of our beliefs, hopes, and experiences. To help us start picking our way through all the different types, Dr. William Russell from Reading University explains the most common varieties of folk tale.
Well, there are really 3 kinds of folk tale, at least if you're not dealing with little tiny anecdotes, but tales of any degree of complex plot. First of all, there are what we call myths. These are rather elaborate cosmic stories about the universe, why we have fire, or how animals got their shape and things like this. Then there are legends, which were the sort of original attempt at history, and very often do contain a lot of real historical material. Finally, there are fairy tales. The word is unfortunate in a way, because most of them don't have any fairies in them, but most of us know what we mean by a fairy tale. It's essentially a tale about not any specific historical character, but somebody with either a very simple name like Jack, or alternatively a very ridiculous and complicated name like Rumpelstiltskin in German, which in the English version is Tom Tit Tot.
Like many of these tales of marvellous happenings, the plot of Tom Tit Tot hinges around the magical power of words, especially names. The girl in this story has to guess the magical name of a demon who has helped her perform an impossible task. Unfortunately, if she fails to guess his name, the demon gets her soul. But as luck would have it, she overhears his name just in the nick of time. Here's Gerard Benson telling what happens when the demon jumps up to the girl's window for the final time.
She opened the window and that come right in on the ledge. That were grinning from ear to ear. And oh, that tail were twirling around wonderful fast. "What's my name?" that said, as that gave her the skeins. "Is that Solomon?" says she, pretending to be afeard. "No, 'tain't," that said, and that come further into the room. "Well, is that Zebedee?" says she. "No, 'tain't that neither," says the impa. Then that laughed, and that twirled that tail till you couldn't hardly see it. "Take your time, woman," that says. "Next guess and you're mine." And that stretched out that's black hands at her. Wow. She backed a step or two, And she looked at it, and then she laughed out, and, says she, pointing her finger at it, "Nimmy, nimmy, not, your name's Tom Tit Tot."
So there. Do you remember Dr. William Russell said there are 3 main types of folk tale? There are fairy tales like Tom Tit Tot, legends, and myths. But despite these various categories, the storytellers just get on with the telling, and it's left to the academic researcher to define the art.
There are 2 aspects to a folk tale. First of all, the main point is it's a traditional tale. By that, I don't mean that it's always exactly the same, because there are all sorts of variations played on a folk tale, but the central outline of the plot, as it were, is kept constant, and it's regarded as important that it should be kept constant, as opposed to normal creative fiction in which people at least try to create a new plot. The second point is that it's usually got to have been told by word of mouth for some time. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be told by word of mouth. It can be told for a long time in writing. Most of the folk tales we know about, in fact, have been transmitted partly by word of mouth and partly by writing.
To illustrate William Russell's point, here's a story from the Scottish oral tradition, although most of us will be more familiar with it in its printed form. It's one of the world's most popular fairy stories, given a unique treatment. The storyteller is Isabel Sutherland.
There was once a king and queen lived together a long time ago. They were very happy, and they had a wee girl, a bonny wee lassie, an awful nice looking wee girl, and the queen herself, she was the bonniest queen that ever was seen. One day, when the princess was only still really just a very wee girl, suddenly her mummy got very, very ill with a fever, and the daddy said, "Oh, away you go and get the doctor." And the doctor came and he saw her, but he couldn't do anything to save her. I mean, it was just one of these things. There was nothing could be done. But just before she died, she said to the wee princess, she says, "I'm going to leave you this wee red calf," she said. "You look after it well, and if there's anything you need, just ask the wee calf, and the wee calf will get it for you." And just soon after that she died, and so the king was really awful upset, and he cried and cried about this, but there was nothing they could do. That was just the way it was. Well, one day when he was out, he met a woman, so he thought to himself, she would be a nice mother for my wee girl, because he was really very worried about her, the wee princess, because she wasn't very old. So he went and he married this woman, and she brought her 3 daughters to live with him, and oh, they were ugly. So the ugly sisters and their mother, they really hated this wee girl, and they took all the nice things, all the nice wee clothes and everything that she had from her mammy, they took them all away from her, and they made her stay in the kitchen, and they made her wear a coat made of rushes, and it was awful uncomfortable to wear, and she used to sit there with this wee scratchy coat, and everybody laughed at her, of course, and they just called her Wee Rushy Coatie.
That's the beginning of Isabel Sutherland's delightful story of Rushy Coatie, but you and I know it better as Cinderella. It's virtually impossible to make a complete separation between literature and the oral tradition. Frequently a story is taken from the people, written down and published, carried across continents, preserved through centuries, only eventually to be picked up by a storyteller who shapes it to his own style and liking and adds it to his own stock of stories. A fact that Stuart Sanderson of Leeds University knows only too well.
Some of my colleagues in Edinburgh University have found tales which we know must have gone into the Hebrides, probably in English, in chapbooks and things like that in the 19th century in printed versions, and have been absorbed from those and then passed on, retold in Gaelic or in English, within a purely oral transmission for some generations.
And what about the storytellers themselves?
In my trade, we call them tradition bearers. There are people who are known to have, in traditional communities, are known to have particular skill as storytellers or as singers or as guardians and transmitters of oral traditions. And these people pass them on from father to son, from grandmother to granddaughter, and so they come down across the centuries.
One of the most interesting of the tradition bearers that Stuart Sanderson was talking about was a gently spoken man called Wilfred Norman from Somerset. His stories and local legends were unearthed by the folklorist Bob Patton. Wilfrid had dozens of fascinating tales about a way of life that's fast disappearing. Here's his account of a local witch, the notorious Fanny Pope.
About 140 years ago, there was a pub at a place called Heathpolt, about 2 miles from Whitten Cross on the Taunton Road. It was used largely by the miners from Brendan Hill. It used to be packed with them. The lady of the pub was called Fanny Pope. She was very clever because not only was she an excellent barmaid, but she could turn herself into a hare. And her grandson earned quite a lot of shillings because if the harriers couldn't find a hare, they came to this boy and he would always put them up one. One day they got pretty close to the hare and the boy shouted, "Hurn, Granny, hurn!" But they got so close that as the hare jumped the hedge, one of the hounds just nipped the hare's leg, but it got away. Well, somebody went into the pub for a pint just afterwards, and Fanny was puffing and blowing and sweating, and she left a little trail of blood as she walked along.
Wilfrid Norman telling the story of Fanny Pope. Stuart Sanderson believes that storytellers fall into two main types. There's what he calls the transmitting machine storyteller, who faithfully reproduces what he's heard with little or no change in his text over a number of years. Then there's the inventive storyteller, who embroiders and changes his story at every telling, putting in jokes and asides, and changing locations and names to fit in with each fresh audience. And when it comes to inventive storytelling, few people are as creative as Ruth Tongue from Somerset. Here she is using a whole range of vocal techniques and histrionic effects. She's telling the story of a disagreement between two magicians, Jack Black and Slippery Sarah, and how Slippery Sarah, living up to her name, gave Jack Black his comeuppance as he hid in the shape of a toad under her doorstep in Hobtree Lane.
Now that'd be Hobtree Lane.